The U.S. Naval War College is a Navy's home of thought. Established in 1884, NWC has become the center of naval sea power, both strategically and intellectually. The following Issues in National Security lecture is specifically designed to offer scholarly lectures to all participants. We hope you enjoy this upcoming discussion and future lectures.
Good afternoon, and welcome to our first Issues in National Security lecture for this academic year. I'm John Jackson, and I will serve as host for today's event. I'd like to note that we're gathered here in person, and we also have an audience gathered via Zoom, and we welcome all of you here and extend a special welcome to Admiral Walker, who's joined us this afternoon. Thank you, sir, for being with us. Over the 2024-25 academic year, we will be offering 10 lectures from some of the best scholars in the world, our resident faculty. This is intended to share a portion of the Naval War College's academic experience with the spouses and significant others of our student body. We also welcome participation by the entire Naval War College extended family, including members of the Naval War College Foundation, international sponsors, civilian employees, colleagues throughout Naval Station Newport, and others around the globe. While the primary purpose is to share information and learn together, we do offer documentation in the form of certificates of completion to all participants who attend at least 70% of the offered lectures. You can participate here in the audience, via Zoom, or even by watching the lectures when they're posted on YouTube. We ask you to keep track of how and when you participate, and we will ask you to self-certify your completion towards the end of the series. Let me highlight the schedule for the rest of the academic year. On 28 January, Professor Sally Payne will talk about geopolitics, Cold War lessons, and the way forward. And this event will be held in Pringle Auditorium, and you need to keep an eye out on the schedule and the location because we do have some variations this year. On 11 February, it happens to be my birthday, Admiral, if you want to note that down. 11 February. Nothing too expensive, please. On 11 February, Professor Chris Sharman will speak about China's naval expansion. 25 February, Professor John Scott Logel will talk about wargaming at the Naval War College since 1887. 11 March, Professor David Burbach will talk about space and national security. On the 25th of March, Professor David Conan is going to put together a recap of a concert that took place on this stage 50 years ago. Johnny Cash and his band played on this auditorium stage. And we have the Cash family involved. We have recorded music from that night, and we have other people threaten to actually pick up a guitar and sing. So we're going to do this as a contemporary civilization lecture. So it's going to happen in the evening, not in the afternoon. So it will be between 1900 to 2030 on that date, on the 25th of March. So plan ahead, that should be fun. 22 April, Chris Faulkner will do a discussion of Russian mercenaries. On the 29th, Professor Orlinda Johnson will talk about warfighters and strategic empathy. And on the 13th, Professor Porter Halliburton the POW from Vietnam, who spent nearly 8 years as a prisoner of war. We bring him back every year so he can tell us about his experience. What we're going to do in this case is we're going to invite our INS participants to join our resident students, either here in person or via Zoom, and we'll do that at 10:30 till 12 o'clock in the morning. Porter's presentation is absolutely remarkable. He wrote poems while he was a prisoner. He reads some of those for us, and he talks about how he survived that 8-year ordeal. And we'll wrap up on the 27th of May with Professor John Maurer doing a presentation on Churchill and America. So, on with the main event. At the conclusion of the presentation that follows, we will welcome questions from our in-person audience. Please use the microphones located at each seat so all of us, including our virtual participants, can hear the questions. We always like to kick the series off with one of our superstars, and we're doing that this afternoon. According to our speaker, Naval War College graduates must think, lead, and fight at the frontier. This goes beyond the frontiers of sea and air to include the frontiers of techno-scientific change, where humans and machines cooperate and collide. This presentation will provide some perspectives on the evolving relationship between humans and machines. It will use historical and modern concepts to examine how human-machine fusion advances our creativity. This includes our fears associated with robotic overlords and Orwellian consequences, along with what it means to be human and how we can lead in the aid of technology. Tim Schultz is the U.S. Naval War College Associate Dean of Academic Affairs. Prior to joining the Newport faculty in 2012, he served as the Dean of the U.S. Air Force's School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. Tim earned his PhD in History of Technology from Duke University, and his research interests include the interaction between technology and strategy and the transformative role of automation in warfare. He is the author of The Problem with Pilots: How Physicians, Engineers, and Air Power Enthusiasts Redefined Flight, and is co-editor of Air Power in the Age of Primacy, Air Warfare Since the Cold War. He is a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy, Colorado State University, the Air Command and Staff College, and the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. Formerly an Air Force colonel, he spent much of his aviation career as a U-2 pilot, enjoying a high-altitude view of interesting places. I'm pleased to pass the microphone on to one of the smartest guys I know, Professor Tim Schultz.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you, John, for that overly generous introduction. I didn't know your birthday was coming up. I know the Admiral knows your birthday was coming up, but sir, I think you know my birthday is actually tomorrow. And I know you're looking for ideas, and you can talk to my wife, Stacy, or my mom, Eileen, right there afterward if you want to collaborate on something. So, but this isn't about me tonight. This is about ideas. And I just want to thank you all for coming out on this early Tuesday evening and joining the Issues of National Security lecture series. You can see what the topic is going to be: humans at the frontier of technology. Here's kind of how I'm going to break it down. I'm going to start out talking a little bit about some frameworks, some ways to look at technological change and how humans interact with technology in the past and present, and maybe in the future. We'll look at some ideas about fusion, or the fusion of humans and machines, sometimes the literal fusion, oftentimes the cooperation between them. We'll investigate some of the fears associated with the evolving frontier of technology, fears like Big Brother and Big Other and artificial intelligence and things of that nature. And then we'll get more into the frontiers, not all of the frontiers, the evolving landscape of technology, but just some ideas about this frontier of technology. So that's kind of a roadmap of where we're going. But first, a question for you in the audience. Who is this? Yeah, okay, somebody immediately recognized this individual as James Bond, 007. You are correct, sir. This is James Bond. He's sitting there in the National Gallery in London. This is from the movie Skyfall. And he's fixating on this artwork, this masterpiece on the wall at the London Gallery. He's soaking up the thesis of this masterpiece, and good art usually has a thesis or an argument, and this one certainly does. This is what has his attention. This is J.M.W. Turner's classic piece that he painted in 1839. It's called The Fighting Temeraire, and it tells a story, and I'll tell that story here momentarily. Fantastic work of art. and James Bond is transfixed by it. Here's the painter, the artist, J.M.W. Turner. He's so well known and so revered in Britain, they put him on the money. He's on the 20-pound note. And you can see what image of his is in the background on that 20-pound note, nothing else but the Fighting Temeraire. It's important. He painted it in 1839 because this was what he saw. He witnessed himself in 1838 standing on the bank of the River Thames as he watched the Fighting Temeraire being towed into harbor. But here's the Fighting Temeraire 33 years earlier in 1805. Here she is in full sail and full glory. She's here with two of her sister ships. In the foreground is the HMS Victory, the flagship of the Royal Navy. This is the one that Horatio Nelson is on. Right behind the Victory, that's the Temeraire. And then right behind her is another sister ship, the Neptune. These are gigantic capital ships. They were the apex predators of their day. There was nothing more powerful. They each had about 100 guns. They were triple deckers. They had 700 to 800 men on board. They were, each of them, the most complex technological system ever built in all of human history by far. At least in 1805. You're looking at it. Enormously destructive in warfare. This painting is called The Heavyweight Punch, which is a pretty good title for this. So this is her in 1805. This is her also in 1805. The Temeraire is here on the far right. The Victory is here on your far left. This is part of the pitched battle at Trafalgar in 1805, and in the middle is a French ship. And this French ship, it's getting the better of Nelson's flagship, the Victory. This French ship, the Redoutable, it's fired numerous cannon shots into the Victory, raked her with musket fire and grenades. Nelson himself is mortally wounded in this battle. He'll soon die. Things are going poorly. And then, just like in a Hollywood movie, out of the smoke, out of the mist, the literal fog of war, the Temeraire approaches and does a broadside cannon fire shot into the Redoutable with all of her guns on her port side. Devastating effect. It kills or wounds outright 200 of the French sailors on the Redoutable. And then the Temeraire is not finished. Then she lashes herself to the Redoutable and continues to pour cannon fire and musket fire into her. But it's not over. Not pictured here is another French ship that comes along called the Fougueux, and it attacks the starboard side, the right side of the Temeraire, and rakes the Temeraire with cannon fire and musket fire, and gets close enough where the Temeraire can lash herself to the Fougueux. So now the Temeraire is lashed to two French battleships, one on the port side, one on the starboard side, and they are going at it, fighting ferociously for 3 hours. The Temeraire and the Victory, they decimate the ship in the center there, the Redoutable, and the other French ship that's lashed to Temeraire starboard side. Finally, the Temeraire gets the upper hand. They kill almost every French officer on the Fougueux and then finally induce her to surrender. So the Temeraire prevails, helps save the day, helps this become a major British victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. So she is renowned as the Fighting Temeraire. She makes a name for herself. Before the battle, this is what Horatio Nelson told his captains. No captain can do very wrong if he places his ship alongside that of the enemy. That is great advice. And that is my advice to Naval War College students. No Naval War College student can do wrong if he or she places him or herself alongside difficult ideas. If they engage vigorously with difficult ideas, if they engage vigorously with their professors, with the material, with their peers, their fellow students, then they are going to mightily benefit. So a little advice from Horatio Nelson. So let's get back to the masterpiece painted in 1839 by J.M.W. Turner. Things are now different. The Temeraire is now 33 years older, and what's happening to her now is she is being pulled into harbor but not to be refitted and repaired. She's being pulled into harbor to be scrapped. She's going to be taken apart plank by plank. Her masts are going to be wrenched out like teeth, and she will be entirely disintegrated. She will be no more. She is officially becoming a relic of the past. And look what is dragging her to her doom. It is this little steam-powered vessel. Temeraire used to be the apex predator, not anymore because the ecosystem has changed. Now steam-powered vessels have risen to dominance. This is like an autonomous vessel because it doesn't care about the wind, it doesn't care about the current. It can maneuver in new ways and do new things. The ecosystem, the circumstances changed. It is rising to power. The great British novelist William Thackeray, he saw this painting and he was lamenting the declining age of sail, and he did not like this little steamboat. And he described it as this, quote, little spiteful, diabolical steamer belching forth a volume of lurid, foul, red-hot, malignant smoke. So he was not a fan of this new technology, but nevertheless, she dragged the Temeraire to her doom. And there's a term for this. This term came along 100 years later in 1942 by an economist named Joseph Schumpeter. He coined this term, the perennial gale of creative destruction, to describe how entrepreneurs pursue innovations that render current practices and preferences and paradigms and policies and the status quo obsolete. This is an engine of change in human affairs driven primarily by human ambition and by institutional ambition. The Temeraire her sails are no longer being filled, but she is being impelled forward into harbor to be scrapped by the gale of creative destruction, and it is inescapable for her. That is why James Bond is staring at this painting, because he himself is sensing this gale of destruction, because if you remember the story from Skyfall, he's getting old. The world is passing him by. His hand shakes when he tries to shoot. He can't pass his psychological exams. He doesn't feel like he can really keep up. He's contemplating his own obsolescence. And in this very scene in Skyfall, I encourage you to watch it, Q comes and sits next to him. And Q is a much younger man, and Q sits down next to him and brags to Bond and says, why James, in the early morning, in my pajamas before my first cup of Earl Grey, I can cause more damage on my laptop computer than you can do in an entire year in the field. And Bond replies that, well, youth is no guarantee of innovation, because he's James Bond, right? He is shaken, not deterred by the gale of creative destruction. But the rest of us may be, because it happens all around us at the frontier of technological change. I'm going to come back to this image at the end because there's a little bit of a twist to it, and we'll talk about that twist at the very end. Meanwhile, since Dr. Sally Payne is going to do the next lecture in a couple of weeks, I want to provide a quote because Sally Payne is a rock star here at the Naval War College. She's wonderful. And here's what she says about the college. It requires all of us, professors and students alike, to get out of our comfort zones, our intellectual and career comfort zones. We can't remain there, and that is true for the frontier of technology. We can't stay in our intellectual and career comfort zones anymore. So let's get into some elements of that now. I'll talk about some of the frameworks first, some ways to look at technological change and this future. And the key lesson about the future is we've been there before. Right? We have faced difficult and exciting futures in the past, and one of the key lessons is that we can recognize ourselves in the past because human nature does not change. My mentor and friend, Dr. Alex Rowland, he likes to say humans change throughout history only in their costume, only in what they wear, and that's it. And I've told many of my students I see out here that very quote before, and so far it seems to be true. So we can see ourselves in the past. I'll give you some evidence of that, how human nature does not change. This is an image taken by one of the very early photographers in the 1830s, Robert Cornelius, and he turned the camera on himself. This is the first selfie in about 1836 or so. He was, in that respect, like the first millennial or the first Gen Z who now take thousands and thousands of selfies. Human nature doesn't change. So as the technology evolved and you're able to take pictures and link them together and make moving pictures or films or movies, guess what the first movies were made about? What was the topic? They were cat videos, just like today. It was filmed in 1894 by Thomas Edison himself. It's called The Boxing Cats. Human nature doesn't change. Here's a cartoon from a British publication in 1906, December 1906. It's a forecast for 1907, and it's featuring this new technology of the wireless telegraph, which we now call the radio. And each individual has a little antenna sticking out of their hats, headwear, and the caption says, "These two figures are not communicating with one another. The lady is receiving an amatory message, and the gentleman some racing results." You see this at your dinner tables all the time, right? It's just a cell phone now instead of a radio. You see this in restaurants. You see this everywhere. Human nature doesn't change. And it doesn't change for institutions sometimes, especially military institutions. Here's the Royal Navy's Admiralty in 1826. They're getting worried about this advent of steam power, these dirty, belching, spiteful, diabolical engines of destruction that are belching forth black, malignant smoke. They are fearful that this will strike a fatal blow at the naval supremacy of the empire. They don't want the status quo to change. Same story at the end of the century, in the early 1900s, about submarines. They're underhand, they're unfair, they're un-English, because they're going to change the status quo. Individuals and institutions, we tend to try to hide in the lee of the gale of creative destruction. It's just natural. We can expect that to happen. So back to this image and another lesson about the future, and that is, we've seen periods of tumultuous change in the past, and many of you, and I count myself in this category, feel like we're on the cusp of some really significant change in the international security environment, in the technological environment in particular. But individuals and societies and cultures have been there before. I'll give you an example of just a 10-year period in American history where Americans faced a lot of change. And that was 1947 to 1957, just a span of 10 years. My mom was just entering her teen years during that time and can remember some of this, I'm sure. The Bell X-1 broke the sound barrier in 1947, ushering a new period or a new phase of air power. Thermonuclear weapons were developed. Nothing says the status quo has changed more than if you are enjoying your little poolside vacation in Las Vegas and look out at the horizon, you see spiraling upward, blooming upward in the atmosphere is a mushroom cloud. The status quo has changed. ICBMs were invented. So was the Air Force. So was the CIA. The first nuclear submarine, the Nautilus, came online. Mom was practicing duck and cover drills in her classroom. The transistor was invented. They've gotten much, much smaller and more sophisticated since then. Sputnik in October of 1957, it shocked the status quo. Watson and Crick discovered the double helix structure of DNA along with Dr. Rosalind Franklin, not pictured here, unfortunately. The pill came online in 1957. Think how that changed the status quo socially, culturally, politically, economically. So we faced these periods of change before, but it seems like something might be a little bit different now. Thomas Friedman from the New York Times identifies three things that kind of feed this difference, this notion of computation and interconnection and innovation all coming together mixing together, and you get this hothouse of creativity, which results in a lot of technological change. I would add to this AI, specifically generative artificial intelligence, machine learning, and that's informing all of these other categories of change. So, yes, human nature doesn't change. These young boys, they're changing in their costume, but they're the same nature, same imagination. But this modern child on the left, he is going to see the world much differently than this young man from the past. And he may be able to manipulate the world differently as well. So here's something I'm going to keep coming back to. This notion of technology radically increasing in capability over time in a nonlinear fashion. This is about as much math as we'll get into tonight, thank goodness. It's nonlinear, it's almost exponential, and this red line, it might describe things like the number of drones in the sky, and now maybe the number of drones being shot down. It might describe the number of patents issued for nanotechnology, or the number of patents for biotechnology, a rapid nonlinear increase. It's the number of people who have submitted their DNA for analysis to 23andMe or Ancestry.com. It's the number of people who are connected to the Internet of Things. It's the number of things in the Internet of Things. It's the number of people carrying a cell phone. All of you are carrying a cell phone, some of you more than one cell phone right now. So there is this nonlinear increase in technological capability. And this is a strategic issue. This is an issue for Naval War College graduates because it not only superempowers nations, but it superempowers individuals and non-state actors and armed groups as well. And that is strategically notable. This is a hockey puck shaped curve, and Thomas Friedman likes to note that since it looks like a hockey stick, it's appropriate to evoke the great Gretzky and his observation, I skate to where the puck is going to be, not to where it has been. That's what we want our Naval War College graduates to do, to think ahead, try to predict where that curve is going to be. But that means we have to consider human capability as well. I very generously gave human capability a slight upward slope here. It's probably a flat line, and those of you who are familiar with teenagers and TikTok and Twitter probably have the line declining somewhat. But human capability does not seem to be increasing much at all, especially compared to many different types of technology. So what can you do? How do you bend this curve of human capability? One way is to find ways to team up, to find ways to do human-machine teaming. And that brings us to this notion of fusion, the fusion of humans and machines in different ways, and how that might help us become more technologically capable, but also keep exerting human control. I'll give you some example of some different fusions of human-machine teaming. We'll start out with one that was a failure. This is an image from 1949. This is a pilot testing, is it feasible to fly an aircraft laying down in the prone position rather than while seated? Because while laying down, your body can withstand twice as many G-forces compared to sitting. And they determined this was too hard. You just couldn't build an airplane around a pilot laying on his or her stomach like this. It looks like a really bad Pilates session. It just didn't work out. This brings me into this notion of cybernetic theory, and this is as technical as we'll get tonight. We're not going to get more theoretical than this, but it turns out the best way to fuse humans and machines involves the exchange of information. And this notion of cybernetic theory was put forth by this guy, a mathematician named Norbert Wiener. He coined the term cybernetic because it's Greek for the word, or it's for the Greek word steersman. And a steersman, somebody who steers a boat, they're taking in information from the environment and using that information to manipulate a control to maintain a constant heading. So it's an information feedback system. That's cybernetics boiled down. But it can become incredibly complex. The math is is fiendishly complex. And Norbert Wiener determined that if you have adequate sensors and adequate computational power, you can have a system with almost any degree of elaborateness of performance. And he's figuring this out in 1947, and boy, was he ever right. Because we certainly see that now, and you'll see examples here shortly. He was still on the flat part of that exponentially increasing curve. For him, the gale of creative destruction was just still maybe a light breeze that he could sense, but he was onto something, and we see it informing this human-machine teaming. Here's an example from around that era. This is from the B-17 flight manual, 1943. Pilots read this, and it tells them below 10,000 feet, you are a flyer, which means below 10,000 feet, you're controlling the aircraft based on your own senses, what you're interpreting about the environment, your own stick and rudder skills. Above 10,000 feet, you are a redesigned machine. Your relationship is different because the B-17 is a cybernetic system. It's an information feedback system when it's doing its job of dropping bombs as it's holding level on a bomb run to try to drop those bombs with great precision. And here's why. The center of that cybernetic system is not the pilot, it's this. In a B-17, it's this automatic device, top secret then, the Norden bomb sight. It's a computer. A crude computer, but it's a computer. And it senses the environment, and it's connected to the autopilot. And here's the bombardier with that equipment. The bombardier connects the Norden bomb sight to the autopilot, and that system flies the B-17 cybernetic system better than a human pilot can. It's a human-machine fusion where human capabilities are displaced by some machine strengths, but the humans are still in charge. Staying in this era, shortly before the war, Hap Arnold, who eventually became the 5-star general presiding over the Army Air Forces, he already saw something coming. In 1937, he's saying we need to relegate the human flyer and elevate the mechanical pilot. At the end of the war, he's seen how pilots' duties have changed, their role has changed. There's almost this fusion, this electronification of pilot skill. And he observes that in 1945, we were using bombers in the Second World War that were unmanned, and he predicted, I think the time is coming when we won't have any men in a bomber. It took a few decades, but indeed, he was correct. Here's Exhibit A, a modern-day Predator pilot who is in the middle of a cybernetic system. He's not on board the aircraft, obviously, but he has overall human agency and control. This is a human-machine teaming, which creates these spectacular effects that you wouldn't be able to do one without the other. So this is humans utilizing that changing curve of technological capability. Here's another example. This is an F-16 with a conspicuous absence of a pilot. It's been rigged to fly automatically. This image is several years old, but the Chief of Staff of the Air Force about 2 decades ago said that this notion of one pilot flying just one airplane, that's kind of a Neanderthal way of thinking. We don't have to think that way anymore. Now one pilot should be able to control multiple aircraft. And indeed now that is the case. I do like this image though of this F-16 with no pilot, because this is what it looks like when a robot takes a selfie now. It looks a little bit different than Robert Cornelius back in the 1830s. So the Air Force now is on the cusp of buying some unmanned aircraft, but they don't like to call them unmanned aircraft. The better term of art is either uncrewed aircraft or even now collaborative combat aircraft. These are coming online where one pilot controls multiple aircraft. Here's what one test pilot said. It's a strange feeling. This notion that I'm flying off the wing of something that's making its own decisions and it's not a human brain. Welcome to the new frontiers of technology. Here's another new frontier of technology involving human and machine interfaces and controls. This is a Ukrainian combatant controlling a drone, and that drone is dropping some type of ordnance with great precision. And I love this picture because it's high-tech, but it's so human as well. So there's some other fusions that are happening. I'll give you just a couple of examples. Here is one from, we'll harken back to 1959 and Robert Heinlein's wonderful novel, Starship Troopers, which my students in the science fiction elective, several of them sitting in here tonight, they read last semester. This book's got a lot going on. This was sort of the origin of the armored suit. This is Johnny Rico talking about his armored suit and what it does for him, and he doesn't really have to think about it, but it greatly empowers him. And the key line here is in the middle. This leaves you with your whole mind free. Your whole mind free so you can do human things like think and plan and use human ingenuity and guile. And hopefully that will help you eventually die in bed, which is the goal of, apparently, of every infantryman. Heinlein, by the way, a U.S. Naval Academy graduate. He didn't spend a long enough time in the Navy to come to the Naval War College, unfortunately. He probably would have been a good B+ student here, I think. So here's the powered suit of modern times. The Army is enamored with this idea, but they scrapped it in 2019. It's too hard. We're just on the flat part of that technological curve. They don't have the battery power to really make this thing useful. They don't have the right materials. That's well off in the distance still. But science fiction was trying to meet science fact. That's one of the frontiers of technology, and they weren't quite there yet with the so-called armored suit. But they're getting there with other things, perhaps. One of them involves this new technology of Neuralink, where a device is embedded underneath the skull, and it allows you to do some interesting things. If you have one of these devices, it's supposed to unlock human potential, but it's a cybernetic interface. Here's the size of it. It's pretty small, a little bit bigger than a quarter, implanted into the brain. It's wireless. It can be recharged wirelessly. To be inserted into the brain, there's an irony here because human surgeons can't do it. It requires a robot surgeon to do it because robot surgeons are far more delicate and effective for this type of procedure than a human brain surgeon ever could be. So this is another interface of human and machine and a reliance on machines to do things humans can't do. But they implanted this into this gentleman a year ago, January of 2024. His name is Noland Arbaugh. And I like his t-shirt there. It says, please use it. Please use my brain, because he can't use his body. He's paralyzed from the neck down. He's a quadriplegic. This implant lets him do things just by thinking, and he can control a mouse or control a keyboard, control a computer just by thinking about it, control it with his thoughts. And he's getting more and more sophisticated at that. Noland Arbaugh, here he is exploring the terrain of the future, this new technological frontier. He's at the forefront of it. And who knows what he's going to be able to do over time, or people like him. And actually, they've implanted another Neuralink device in a second patient, and that patient is doing very well. And then they're moving on towards this notion of connecting them with prosthetic devices as well. So this is a pretty exciting area where this technology capability curve is really starting to get steeper, and humans are finding a way to integrate with it. A little more on human-machine teaming, kind of in that same regime. DARPA is interested in this neuro interface with its new next-gen non-surgical neurotechnology where they inject stuff into your bloodstream that can get into your brain. It's small enough to get in your brain, and it can affect the neurons where you can basically have a two-way interface between the brain and an outsider, and information can flow both ways. And that has interesting connotations, some of them perhaps kind of sinister, but nevertheless, it is worth perhaps pursuing for certain objectives. This is looking a little farther out in the future of human-machine interfaces. There's a lot of hype associated with this notion of the singularity where humans someday will be able to upload their own personality, upload their brain, upload their connectome into the cloud or into some type of device and become immortal. So this is where Physics becomes more like metaphysics. It's kind of a techno-mystical ideation, but there are people thinking seriously about that. And you may not be able to read the little caption at the bottom. It says, if you believe humans and machines will become one, welcome to the singularity movements. So this apparently is some type of a movement. We'll see where it goes. There's a lot of hype associated with this. And when there's hype about things, hype is often a close cousin to fear about things, because humans love to hype things up and oftentimes generate fears and concerns as well. So let's talk about that now a little bit. Fears at the frontier of technology. So universally recognizable figure here. This is intriguing in so many ways, but one of those ways is the Terminator is on Hollywood's list of top 100 villains, unsurprising, but it's the only character to also be on Hollywood's list of top 100 heroes as well. So what an interesting character. What I find also interesting is the Terminator's eye, because the writers and producers and designers associated with this, they were borrowing something from earlier in the science fiction realm. They were borrowing something from the movie, the 1968 movie called 2001: A Space Odyssey. That Terminator eye is the evil robot of HAL 9000. It's the exact same design. They're both so menacing and murderous in their character. It's the perfect design for the Terminator's eye. So this crystallized, this image, both images crystallize a lot of the fears of technological change, but it turns out that's not really something we have to be concerned about right now. The Terminator is not going to walk into Spruance Auditorium and start to wreak havoc, but technology might wreak havoc in other ways, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Havoc was wrought for the great chess player Garry Kasparov in 1997 when he was crushed by a computer. He didn't expect to lose. Nobody expected him to lose, and it stung. He was shaken by this, and a lot of people thought, oh, this is an inflection point for humanity. And maybe it was to some degree, but we're still playing chess and doing other things, even though computers can do them better than us. But this gets me into some fears that I mentioned earlier: Big Brother, Big Other, and artificial creator. We'll talk about each in turn. We all are familiar with Big Brother, a sort of fiction/science fiction novel from Orwell in 1948. We're familiar with the thesis: Big Brother sees all and is the controlling element of an autocratic system. Well, Big Brother relies on this notion of the panopticon. The panopticon is a device that sees everything. Pan-opto. Pan means everything, like pandemic. Optics means to see. This notion of seeing everything, it's an old idea put forth in the late 1700s, and they would use this phenomenon in prisons. If you have a guard tower with tinted windows, it doesn't matter if there's a guard in the tower or not, it's going to shape the behavior of the prisoners, whether or not there's actually being observed or not, because they think they might be observed. Same phenomenon in modern times. You see panopticons or panoptica everywhere. Who here has been to Tiananmen Square in the past 10 years or so? It's riddled with these panopticon devices, cameras everywhere. But you see them in Western cities as well, cameras everywhere, helping keep honest people honest, having a deterrent effect. It shapes behavior. This is a portable police panopticon in New York City trying to shape behavior somehow. If you think you can be seen, it shapes what you might or might not do. These Chinese police officers are sporting the latest in panopticon fashions. They're wearing glasses with cameras that are connected to their phones, and their phones have an AI program, and it lets them do instantaneous facial recognition. So they can just look at somebody and know exactly who they are. It's an electronic stop and frisk. And nobody knows that they're being stopped and frisked in this digital sense. It's a great way for governments to exert power. These young Chinese women, they all have a panopticon in their pockets, just like all of us do here as well. And they're also being observed in terms of their social credit score. So this is another way of scooping up information to help maintain order in society, and we know how that can go in a very negative direction. Closely related to this idea of Big Brother, the state having a lot of control, is control coming from other sources, primarily from marketplace sources. This notion of Big Other, it's put forth in this wonderful book by Shoshana Zuboff, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And she says it's the fight for a human future at the new frontier of power, at a new technological frontier. And she talks about how we are providing so much data out there that's being used ostensibly for our good, but it also can be used to our discredit or our disadvantage. Nowadays, and all of us, many of us have this situation, the TV that hears you, the house that knows you, the book that reads you. It takes note of your preferences. We all are things in the Internet of Things. It's part of the Big Other phenomenon. John Jackson has a Nest thermometer in his house. Anybody else here have a Nest thermometer? Want to admit it? I see a few hands creeping up. That's great. It's a little panopticon in your house. It's recording your patterns of life. It knows a lot about you because it's trying to help you be efficient and everything like that. They're pretty cool, but they do have a little bit of a sinister type of effect because they're examining your patterns of life. I keep writing letters to the Nest thermostat company and say, just redesign your thermostat and make it look like what it really is. You don't have to make any big changes, just make it look like this. They just won't respond to my emails for some reason. Some of you have this type of a doorbell, the Ring doorbell. It's a panopticon looking outward into the community that can be used in different ways. I put this long quote up here because it's interesting in three ways: what it says, who said it, and when he said it. I'll just give you a minute to read it. So we know where you are, where you've been, and what you're thinking about. Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, and look at the 2010 this is happening. Now, 15 years later, it's orders of magnitude more capable and essentially doing the same thing. A powerful effect of the Big Other. Think of the social, technical, cultural, political changes that might be involved with that. A few minutes on this notion of an artificial creator. Anybody recognize her? She's a famous European. She's from Italy. Beautiful young woman. Here's another picture of her at a coffee shop. She look a little more familiar now. And here's those images, probably off her Instagram. And here is who she really is. Aren't those beautiful renditions, though, of a person that did exist, and Da Vinci captured her beautifully, but so do these images. This is a pretty unsophisticated, relatively modern AI, generative AI program that can do this and can render things and make them look awfully real. So how now in this modern world, how can we discern between what is true and what isn't? And I did not realize when I saw this image who it really was until I saw this image. And then finally, well, to be honest, it was this image before I figured it out. The real Morgan Freeman or the fake one? This is a deep fake of him. It looks exactly like him. And it can be made to say things like him, and it is indistinguishable from the real Morgan Freeman. And you can do this with anybody. Now, if you didn't know the political context, you would think, there's a couple of old buddies out in the woods. But we know with the political context, this is probably a deep fake. I don't think this has happened. But it's pretty cool, interesting, sophisticated technology. It's getting on that steep part of the curve, isn't it? But think of what this can be done to wreak havoc. And this could just be individuals in a basement who are using this type of technology. And it gets to this notion of what a historian and philosopher from Israel says, Yuval Harari, humans are being hacked. I mean, the essence of who we are is being hacked by this modern, generative, sophisticated artificial intelligence. For the first time in human history, we have something that is as creative as we are. And we can't distinguish it between its creations and our creations and tell which one is human and which one is machine generated. In many respects, you can't tell. And that means something different for human civilization, because that has never happened at scale before. And these generative AIs, these smart programs, they can cocoon you in your own kind of world of information based on your preferences, and all of your preferences have been scooped up already, and it can feed you those preferences back and kind of shape your opinion, and maybe you start to lose agency over time. That is something that is worthy of some, if not fear, then at least some notable concern. Tangential to that is the remarks of Ken Jennings when he lost to a computer way back in 2011. This happened. I like what he says here because he invokes the Terminator. It is not a Terminator laser eyepiece tracking you down. It's just a line on a graph getting closer and closer to the thing you can do that you thought maybe was human and irreplaceable. That getting closer to that line on the graph, and it's challenging what it means to be human in the age of technology, because sometimes we can't distinguish between what is human and what isn't human anymore. And that is a challenge for our professors and our students and our graduates. Okay. So we'll get ready to wind it up here with a little bit of time on the frontiers of technology. And there's a whole bunch of different things we could look at. Unmanned systems, that's John Jackson's specialty. Teaches a wonderful course this spring trimester in unmanned systems. You can see a drone operator from Ukraine, a Ukrainian uncrewed surface vessel. On the bottom right, those are Iranian-made missiles being launched, and probably launched from Yemen into the Red Sea, or bigger ones being launched into Israel. These are becoming increasingly ubiquitous in this new frontier of technology. Cheap and accessible, and human ingenuity is just on full display. Here's our headlines regarding the Navy just from this last year. These are all within the last 12 months. You can see the Navy's growing interest. It's not the only thing the Navy's interested in, but there is definitely a growing interest. New robotics warfare specialist, a robo-ship squadron, and the Pentagon is pursuing its replicator system. This is a 2-year-old initiative put forth by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks. It's gaining a lot of momentum, this notion we need to mass produce some type of unmanned, uncrewed capability that's cheap but effective enough, and not just in the air, but on the sea, under the sea, on the land as well, and we really desperately need it in the Pacific. This replicator initiative has gotten a lot of traction, but it also suggests that you need to network all of this somehow. You need to have a cognizance of the battle space to all of this, for all of this to make sense. And that requires a lot of computational power and elaborateness of performance, a vast cybernetic system which comes with that. And how will human agency fit into that? How will humans maintain cognitive control of the battle space? How will we cognify combat? And since I'm a historian, I'm going to give you another quick historical example of cognifying combat. Here is Colonel Benjamin Davis from the Second World War, a famed fighter pilot. He had sharp eyes, fast reflexes, and a killer instinct. That's what made him great. Here's his counterpart from the Vietnam War, Colonel Robin Olds. He had sharp eyes, fast reflexes, and a killer instinct, and an outstanding mustache, I have to add. Both of them, they cognified combat primarily through their own senses, their view of the battle space, their human senses. Yes, Colonel Olds in Vietnam, he had more help electronically in his fighter aircraft, but he's still relying on his own wherewithal, his own senses. Well, combat is cognified differently now if you look at the modern version of a fighter pilot, like an F-35 pilot. This F-35 pilot, I'm sure, has sharp eyes and fast reflexes and a killer instinct. I don't know about the mustache, but they see the world differently. Look what he says. You can look through the jet's eyeballs to see the world as the jet sees the world. And if you're shooting and killing something, it's beyond visual range. You can never see it with the naked eye. It's all aided by computerized sensors and systems that enable you to do that. Very unlike the way aerial combat used to take place. This is a fundamental change. 2020 vision, that's such a 20th century concept now. Now machine vision is what's important in the 21st century. One more little divot in the history here, because I like this photo. Some of my students have seen it. On the right here is a robot, a flying robot. It's a German V-1 cruise missile over the English Channel in probably 1944, in the late summer of 44. It's been intercepted by a British Spitfire, and the Spitfire pilot is probably flying at about 400 miles an hour over the English Channel, and he's sidling up next to the V1. He's putting his wingtip under the V1, and he's flipping the V1 over. It's called V1 tipping, because if you flip the V1, it tumbles its gyro and it spirals down into the English Channel and doesn't explode somewhere in London. This is easy against a robot that doesn't think and doesn't react, but that is not the case at the new frontier of technology. Now aircraft flown by artificial intelligence can react, and they can react faster than you. This is a DARPA, an Air Force project called VISTA. Yes, there are two aviators here in this F-16, but it's being controlled by artificial intelligence. And it fights against manned aircraft, and it has gained a record of generally prevailing against those manned aircraft. This system is becoming so good that last summer, the Secretary of the Air Force went out, and he flew in that same aircraft. There he is, Frank Kendall, and you can see what he went up in this aircraft, and this is what he observed. They went against a pilot in another aircraft with thousands of hours experience. I think the Secretary's being diplomatic here. It was roughly an even fight, but against a less experienced pilot, the AI, the automation would have performed better. Welcome to the modern frontier. In the future, you may not know if who or what you're fighting is a human or a robot. How could you tell? They're passing the Turing test. That unmanned machine might be indistinguishable from a manned machine in terms of its capability. In fact, the way you might be able to tell the difference is because if it's so much better than you are, it's probably flown by a machine. But these things are certainly passing the Turing test, which brings me back to the British currency. We saw that J.M.W. Turner was on the 20-pound note. Guess who's on the 50-pound note? I just mentioned the Turing test. Alan Turing is now on the 50-pound note in British currency. He's played a large part in the Allied victory in the Second World War with his expertise in cryptology. He's one of the titans of the information age. And he published in 1950, 75 years ago, this fantastic seminal paper on computing and intelligence, computing machines and intelligence, where he said it's very hard to define what a machine is and what thinking is. And he came up with this so-called imitation game, which we now call the Turing test. You may not be able to tell if something is human or not. And a lot of things are passing the Turing test now. On the money is this quote in the very bottom right hand of a 50-pound note. And I'm going to blow it up here for you. This is only a foretaste of what is to come and only the shadow of what is going to be. He's thinking about the frontier of technology. How prescient Alan Turing was. He was thinking about the perennial gale of creative destruction, and he was well ahead of the game. Okay. Still at this frontier, it's not all technological. A lot of it's ethics, a lot of it's political and cultural and moral. Will ethics keep pace with technological change? It doesn't. Law does not keep pace. Societal norms do not keep pace. They always lag behind. That is a challenge for all of us. It's a challenge for our graduates, most certainly. There are some key questions we can ask ourselves, and these weren't ones I dreamed up. These were dreamed up by this gentleman here, Immanuel Kant, in the late 1700s. 3 classic questions. What can we know? What should we do? And what may we hope? These are good questions to continually ask ourselves at the frontier of technological change. Here's one approach to it. As machines learn, humans need to unlearn. We need to disenthrall ourselves from the status quo, get out of this institutional inertia, set aside our previous conceptions, and think differently. We have to unlearn the old way of doing business in order to really exploit the technological frontier. As machines operate, humans are orchestrators. They're hewing these machine operations towards a human purpose, ideally. As machines imitate, like Turing might say, humans need to still be the creative force. We see that being diminished now with machine learning, but still it is humans who are creating and shaping those machines even now. And as machines are artificial, it is humans who are ethical. How are human values reflected in our technological world? Revisiting Garry Kasparov for a moment. Yes, he was crushed in 1997 by a computer, but as he matured, he realized this was something that was very good for him. It helped him become more human. It helped him become actually a better chess player. It helped him to focus on what makes us human, our mind, our intellect. It made him better, and may that be a lesson really for all of us. My last little bit of history here before we get back to the Fighting Temeraire. Every student on their first day of orientation, they see this image from me here in Spruance Hall because Lincoln in 1860 said it so well. We must think anew and act anew. That too is perennial, along with the gale of creative destruction. So finally, we're back to J.M.W. Turner and the Fighting Temeraire. Here's the little twists. When I first look at this, and maybe when you first look at it, you think, oh, the poor, gallant sailing ship. Bond calls her a bloody big ship. She's being dragged to her doom. The sun is setting on the Fighting Temeraire. But what is really happening is, based on where she was and where Turner, the artist, was standing, he's not looking at a sunset. He's not looking west. He's looking east. This is an eastern vantage. The sun is rising on this scenario. So, do we look at this as a lamentation, or do we look at it as a celebration? Your perspective matters as we move forward into the frontier of technology. Thank you very much for coming tonight. And John, I ran a little long. I apologize. Up to you if you want to do any Q&A.
No, I want to go home and kick my Roomba. I don't like the way this robot thing is going, but no, we certainly have time for a few questions. If you'd like to call on anybody.
Sure.
Tim? Any questions?
Go ahead, please. Oh, yes, and there's a microphone there, and that way people online can hear you.
Hi. Hello. Thank you so much. It was a very fascinating lecture, really, really interesting.
Thank you.
I come down, I guess, in my brain about the cost of training people in, sort of like door-to-door combat, as opposed to, sending machines out in the world, and maybe it comes down to cost-benefit analysis, not only of, lives, but of actual monetary factors there. So it just was something that you triggered in my little brain, so thank you.
Okay, thank you for bringing that up. The cost can be measured in many ways: the economic cost, the political cost, the human cost. A couple of thoughts come to mind. If you remember that image of the drone operator, the guy smoking the cigarette, with the drone thing, he can be trained to do that in about 16 hours. Very cheap, very fast, and he becomes a very effective technologized combatant, so super low cost. And it's at a low cost to him because he's not in a trench facing Russian, I almost said Soviet, Russian machine gun fire. But there's another thing about the cost here that I always kind of think about. If with unmanned, uncrewed systems, if you create options for political leaders, and that's the general purpose of the military, to create options for political leaders, but if you can create low-cost options to project power, to project violence, because remember this scale of creative destruction, it involves the marketplace of violence as well as the economic marketplace. If it's easier and cheaper to project power and violence, does it lower the political cost of projecting power and violence? And are we no longer reserving the use of military power as a last resort? And that's a just war theory issue. So does it make it easier to fight by lowering those costs? That's a problem. That's a strategic problem. Hopefully, our political leaders, not just of our nation, but every nation, they will take that into account and not be too tempted by the shifting cost dynamic. So that topic, we can go a lot of different directions on that. Thank you for that question.
Other questions?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Sir Minda from NSC, class 2025 from Lithuania. Thank you, very interesting presentation. I would like to hear your opinion on the argument that science fiction is driving some of the development as like self-fulfilling prophecy that we're kind of inventing, that we're seeing. How much do you find it true? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
That's an outstanding question, close to my heart, because of the science fiction course. We teach, of course, science fiction ideations and explorations for modern leaders. Science fiction, it influences technological development. I wouldn't say it drives it. The notion of the armored suit from 1959, that can shape the imaginations of the young men reading this book who later on become scientists, engineers, young women as well. The communicator in Star Trek, when the Enterprise crew went, the Star Trek actors went and met a lot of NASA engineers. Boy, they were rock stars there when they went to NASA, years after the original series was over. So it enthralls people's imagination. Science fiction can also help you kind of chart a course into the future and writing a history that hasn't been invented yet. And it can give you something to shoot for, like NASA's project to, say, identify distant planets in distant solar systems. That's a science fiction idea, but they can start developing technology based on that yet unproven idea. So it does animate thinkers, it animates people who assign budgets, it animates institutions, if you can weave in sort of this fictional narrative about what the future might be. There's a lot of different ways we could go with that, because science fiction also warns you about potential futures and how you might avoid those. One of the books that we start out with in the course is the original science fiction book, the first true science fiction book, which is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And it's a cautionary tale about what scientists should think about to avoid doing. So there's different ways you can go on that as well. Come talk to me afterwards if you want to talk more sci-fi. So.
Tim, I'm going to take the opportunity for the final question here.
Yes, sir.
A lot of what you talk about shows an incredibly fast-moving process. Can you reflect on DoD's ability to react and the degree to which we are married to existing systems? And other than the replicator initiative, are you seeing signs that DoD is taking this to heart?
As a large institution or institutions within a large institution, the Department of Defense tends to be sclerotic and slow and bound by inertia like any large institution, but there are glimmers where that doesn't happen. It's the Defense Innovation Unit, which has helped propel forward this replicator initiative that Kathleen Hicks has put forward. That is becoming a notable success, and it had a lot of detractors at the beginning. You saw the Navy's commitment to developing unmanned our uncrewed systems with this Project 59 task force, and they're developing this robotic specialty now and robo squadrons. Those are pretty good indications of this felt need to adapt, because it's that lesson of the gale of creative destruction. You don't want to be relying on the temporary type of technology when steam power is going to put you at a disadvantage. It's hard for institutions to shift and realize that. That takes mavericks who have graduated from the Naval War College to help push that and shape that. It also takes good political leadership too. So yes, it's slow, but there are glimmers of hope as well. So thank you, John.
Once again, thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Tim, for leading off this series with a fabulous discussion. We'll see you all back here on the 28th, and we'll talk about China and the outgrowth of the Cold War and where we might be going forward. So kick your robots and have a good night.